You're listening to the No Bullshit Vegan Podcast, episode 199. Psychologist, vegan educator, and author Dr. Angela Crawford joins me today to discuss some of the psychological, emotional, and social aspects of being vegan.
Welcome to the No Bullshit Vegan Podcast. Myth-busting and evidence-based advice to help you kick butt with your health and fitness on a vegan diet. Here's your host, Karina Inkster.
Hey, welcome to the show. I'm Karina, your go-to no BS vegan fitness and nutrition coach. Thanks for tuning in today. As you can tell from today's episode number, we're about to hit episode 200. And that also happens to coincide, kind of closely anyway, with my 39th birthday. So clearly that calls for an unnecessarily epic celebration. And you're invited. You can reserve your free spot at our show notes, nobullshitvegan.com/199. So I'm going to be hosting 3 different events. First is a Zoom food prep party where you can join me and my kitchen manager, Ripley, the cat, to bake black bean brownies. Or you can just watch cooking show style and get top secret vegan intel and bring your questions for me to answer. It's generally just going to be a food prep party that anyone can join. And then we have a live workout that I'm leading on Facebook and Instagram, which will be a full body strength session you can do from the comfort of your living room because no equipment is required and all levels are welcome. And then what I think is the most exciting is a live podcast recording of episode number 200, complete with behind the scenes chaos and surprise guests. So you can watch the recording, you can join in the text chat, or you can even call in and be part of the episode. And this is the first episode I've ever recorded live, so what could go wrong? So this is all happening June 14th to 21st. One sign up gets you access to all 3 events. No cost, no fluff, no diets, no bullshit, possibly some disco lights. Sign up at nobullshitvegan.com/199. See you there. Introducing my guest today, Dr. Angela Crawford. She's a psychologist, vegan educator, and author of The Vegan Transformation, A Journey to Heal Yourself and the World. She holds a doctorate in clinical psychology and previously worked as a psychotherapist for 25 years, empowering clients toward greater holistic well-being. She speaks and teaches about the psychological benefits of veganism, thriving emotionally with a vegan lifestyle, overcoming barriers to change, the food-mood connection, and awakening compassion. She's passionate about the power of personal transformation to create a more fulfilling, healthy, and purposeful life, and a kinder, more sustainable world. Angela's favorite meal is vegan crab cakes. Now, I'm not sure if she makes her own, but I do actually get the Gardein brand ones sometimes. They're pretty decent. Not my favorite, but they're good. Here's our conversation. Angela, thank you so much for speaking with me today.
Oh, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
I'm excited to dig into your new book and the work that you do, but I want to start off by asking, how did you come to veganism? So everyone who is on the show who is vegan, because not all guests are, but everyone who is gets asked, what's your vegan backstory?
Well, I love sharing it. I think I learn more about it the more I reflect on it, because sometimes you discover new parts of it that you didn't realize at first. But for me, it started with becoming vegetarian, which was late 2006, early 2007. And that started when I happened to see a program. It was a news feature on PBS that had a segment about workers in a meat processing plant. And it didn't really show any of the gory details, but it showed that these were the workers. Many of them were immigrants and had few financial resources. And so they're working in this job where there were a lot of injuries. And the program was highlighting that a lot of times the workers were discouraged from getting treatment or taking time off work, or they might lose their job. And it just struck me as really unjust. And I hadn't really thought much about how my food got to me before then. And I just suddenly seeing that program just got me thinking about it. And very quickly, I started to think, well, if you don't like how the workers are treated, what about the animals? And that just led me down a whole path that the very next day, I went to Barnes & Noble. I bought a plant-based cookbook and I made my first recipe. And this was a big deal because I was not a cook. I wasn't into food prep very much. I ate a lot of comfort and convenience foods. And it was a roasted red pepper, spinach, and artichoke lasagna. And which doesn't seem like the simplest recipe for someone just trying it out, but it just spoke to me, I guess. I tried it out. I had to buy new pots and pans while I was cooking. And it turned out really delicious. And I just started reading all these books about veganism and vegetarianism and everything I learned about the ethics of how animals are treated and factory farming and the environment and the health aspects, because I have a family history of heart disease, and then I read about Dean Ornish's work, reversing heart disease. So all this, I just felt like, wow, I'd never really known any of this before. And I grew up in the Midwest. I saw cows in the field, but I had no idea about factory farming or intensive animal agriculture. So I started first with becoming vegetarian. I just quickly, upon reading this, I started to make that connection that I just didn't want to have animal flesh. And I tried to read a lot nutritionally too, because I wanted to do it the right way. I wasn't sure about this new path and I wanted to do it well. And so I'd read everything I could about, what nutrients I needed. And so I became fully vegetarian first. And I felt really good about that. But over time, I started to understand more about the egg laying hens and the dairy cows and just all the other choices that we make that cause similar harm to animals. And I also discovered too that having dairy was having an effect on me in ways I hadn't realized before. For example, congestion, sinus issues, skin issues. I'd go through periods where I'd cut it out of my diet and then have it back in, and then all of a sudden these things would return. So finally, I just knew, okay, you need to go fully vegan. I wish it had happened sooner, but it actually was not until early 2019 that finally something in me shifted enough to know, okay, I'm going to figure this out. I'm going to do this, and overcome whatever blocks were in my way of taking that final step. But I read some books that helped me and made that commitment. And so then I became fully vegan. And when I did that, I knew it was about more than just me, that I wanted also to help others on this journey. So that's sort of what's led to the book and other things that I've been doing, because I just feel like it helps so many things, our own well-being, as well as other things we care about, like animals and the planet. So it just all came together for me.
Right. Well, thank you for sharing. A lot of what you said, I can agree with, obviously, but also relate to. I was vegetarian first too, and it took me 5 years to figure out that the dairy and the meat and the egg industries are all one and the same. They all support each other. And back then, I'm not using it as an excuse, but we didn't have social media. We didn't have YouTube. I went vegan in 2003. So it's been a while. But, as soon as we make that connection, I feel like that's usually enough to make quite a distinct change. And you also mentioned you had some kind of like allergy adjacent symptoms, which I also had. Didn't know it was from dairy. But when I first went vegan, I tried it for a month. So took out dairy, took out eggs, and all those weird symptoms like having hay fever in the winter, which made no sense, they went away. And then I remember I was 16 at the time. I was at a friend's house for Halloween. And so after my month of being vegan, which happened to be October, it's now Halloween with a whole bunch of milk chocolate lying around, which I ate. And almost immediately, all of those symptoms came back, like within 24 hours. I'm like, oh, well, if that's not a sign, one of many, right? So I can totally relate to that. It is about ethics. That's why I went vegetarian and why I went vegan in the first place. But it also branches out into a lot of other aspects. And I think that's some of what you talk about in your book. So congrats, by the way. Brand new book just came out, The Vegan Transformation, A Journey to Heal Yourself and the World. Can you tell me about what that book encompasses? It's not just about what we eat.
Yeah. Well, as I became vegan, one of the things that I noticed is my life opened up in ways that I hadn't expected. There was something about making this commitment to align with my values in a way that made me have to be different than those around me and to say no to certain things, to overcome people pleasing, to realize something mattered enough to speak up about it. All these changes started to unfold on a more psychological, emotional, and spiritual level. So there were some challenges. I had to learn to handle social situations and how to navigate those. But at the same time, there were also benefits like freedom, peace, a greater sense of purpose, because something I was doing every day by changing what I ate, as well as sharing it with others, was having an impact on so many things I cared about. And I felt more authentic. I felt more true to myself. So all these things happen that instead of it being depriving, like I might have feared, and I know a lot of people before they become vegan, think, oh, it could be depriving. But it turned out not to be that way for me at all. It was abundant and fulfilling. And as I got to know other vegans through networking groups and other things I was involved in, I found that a lot of other vegans were saying the same thing, that there were psychological and emotional changes that came with this lifestyle. So I felt like there was a lot of research on the health aspects of veganism. And, and there's a fair amount of books that cover the ethical reasons we should become vegan, but not so much about what happens inside of us when we honor our values and embark on a vegan lifestyle. So I wanted to look at more of that psychological, emotional, spiritual aspect of being vegan and the positives of it as well, because again, I didn't see much about that. And there is so much positive. So I surveyed and interviewed vegans about, well, one, what led them to become vegan, but then once they did, what were the benefits that they had in terms of their emotional well-being and their spiritual well-being. And I started with surveys, and from there went into interviews with 75 of the people that I surveyed to get more in depth. And so I then kind of pulled that all together into some core transformational principles that came through. And so the book shares what those transformational themes were that came through the surveys and interviews, things that can make our life more fulfilling, whether we're vegan or not. But something about being vegan seems to really help facilitate some of the things that I discovered. And also there are a couple chapters about handling the challenges of being vegan too, so it's really meant to embrace wherever someone is at on the journey, whether they're veg curious, whether they're on the vegan path, or even have been vegan a while, but just like to keep learning and reading and having support for their journey.
This is awesome. I've been pretty active lately in various vegan subreddits. And one of the themes that I'm seeing, for whatever reason now more than ever, is this feeling of isolation or, I always have to be that one vegan at the family gathering, and it's psychologically and socially challenging for a lot of folks. So something like this could be a resource for, brainstorming and also how to manage those types of events, ideas. Yeah. And I think that's pretty important, because I often say the hardest part of veganism for me is nothing to do with the actual diet. It's to see other people who aren't vegan go and buy carcasses at the grocery store like it's totally normal, Yeah. That's the hardest part of veganism for me, even with lots of food allergies and like obsessively reading labels all the time on top of being vegan. It's not the food. That's not the hard part. So I think a resource like this is much needed. And also some research into this area, I think, is needed, because from what I understand, there's been some work that looks at mental health and veganism, but often veganism has been tied with depression and anxiety, which in a way I'm like, well, obviously, because we look at the state of the world and, what other reaction do we have to it? But at the same time, what about the aspect of living in a way that aligns with our values, eating in a way that aligns with our values? That is super powerful. What kind of work in the future would you want to see in terms of peer-reviewed work?
Well, I mean, the things you're naming are all super important. There have been some studies on some of these topics, but as far as really rigorous studies, probably not as much. You mentioned the social aspects of being vegan and people mentioning that they're isolated. There has been research that's more correlational, but asking people who were former vegans but didn't stay vegan, things like that, what were the factors that interfered? And what they found was the social piece was the most common theme that would get in the way for people, whether it was being different than other people, whether it was having to speak up or having a non-vegan partner. So I think continuing to understand the more psychosocial aspects is important, because I think they're starting to be looked at a lot more, but in a lot of the trainings that I've been in, that's been overlooked. It's more like, oh, teach people the nutrition or just tell them the reasons and then they'll do it. Well, sometimes that happens, but for a lot of people, their own inner barriers as well as social barriers get in the way. So I think continuing to understand those more is important.
Right.
And how do we help people overcome them?
Yeah. Well, I want to go into that in a little bit more detail, but I want to go back to something you said first around deprivation and how people who aren't vegan, and I love the term pre-vegan, by the way, you use that in some of your writing. Pre-vegans, they often see veganism as, oh, you have to avoid this and oh, you have to remove this from your diet. And it's all deprivation based versus let's try some new plant-based foods you've never had. Let's fill our plates as much as possible with foods that happen to be plants. There's these kind of two viewpoints. Yeah. So in the research that you did for your book or just the work that you do in general, what have you seen in that realm of the deprivation versus abundance mindset?
Yeah. What I seem to find in the people I talked to was the majority ended up seeing this lifestyle as incredibly abundant. I think it's one of those factors where when we haven't tried the lifestyle or haven't done it long enough to get it down, how to do it well, you can think it's limiting because you don't know what it involves. There's not a lot of models in our culture for what a vibrant, abundant plant-based diet could look like. You know, I think for me, what happened, I later realized this in retrospect, is about a few months before I became vegetarian, I had eaten at a conference center that had all plant-based meals. And the food was really delicious. And there was so much variety. All these things I would have never thought of eating before. I just never would have considered things like scrambled tofu, with veggies and just all these different meals and different ethnic foods that had different spices. And so eating that was so good and it was so abundant. I think that's part of what opened me up when I saw the PBS program to being more able to consider this path. And so I think what I found from talking to most vegans is that they've come to see that this is an abundant lifestyle, that their food choices have expanded beyond what they ever envisioned. And that certainly happened for me, trying all kinds of foods I'd never considered.
Me too.
So the most common theme that I hear, and you've probably heard this too, is my main regret is I didn't do this sooner.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, even from being vegetarian to then going full vegan, I increased the number of really interesting ingredients and foods that were a regular part of my diet by I don't know how many times, like a lot.
Yeah, I resonate with that.
Yeah, for sure. Interesting. So how does that piece fit in with what we were just talking about in terms of social isolation, feeling like you're singled out? As an example, I have a friend who's not even vegan or vegetarian officially. Let's just call her plant forward. Everyone knows she doesn't eat meat. But, in terms of going to a family event, she dreads going because she knows she's going to have people asking questions or saying, oh, why aren't you eating the lamb? Which happened just a few days ago. And so, she doesn't label herself as anything, but everyone knows she doesn't eat red meat at least. And she's not even vegan. And she has this dread about going to family events. So how does that piece of the weirdness in social events fit with, well, actually, we're living an abundant lifestyle and we're acting in alignment with our values?
I think a few things that help. And I think those feelings that you're describing can be more common early on people's journeys, because over time, I think many of us discover ways to handle that and come to peace with that. But you have to get through that early stage to get to a later stage. So I think, and I struggled with some of those feelings, so I can understand them. I think first to acknowledge we are social creatures. So as much as many of us like to think we're very independent and don't care what anyone thinks, there is something wired into most of us that does have some caring what people think and that is wanting to fit in. So we vary in how much we feel that way, but a lot of people do struggle with that. So first, just to normalize it, that wanting to fit in socially is sort of ingrained in us. And, I think things that have helped me and helped other people that I've talked to, because I did ask the people I interviewed if they had challenges, what were some of the things that helped them? So I came up with some key points that people shared with me. one key point is first having a really strong why motivation for why you're doing it. Because if you can connect with that why, it helps you have more commitment to discovering how to navigate the different challenges that are going to come up. Because let's face it, with any lifestyle change, there's challenges, not just this one. Plant-based eating has its own challenges because we are different than the majority of people around us. So it adds in this social thing that some changes wouldn't have. But so first is that strong motivation and connecting with that regularly, because I know when I was first becoming vegan, handling social situations, I was like, how am I going to handle like family gatherings where they're having these certain foods and they're going to exactly like what your friend is saying, they're going to expect me to eat this or that. And what do I say? But when I kept connecting with why I was doing this, what my motivations were, I reminded myself it's worth learning these skills to handle things I'm not used to handling, because we're used to just eating like everyone does around us. It takes a certain skill set to navigate that. So first, okay, I'm willing to learn it. And then secondly, I need to be more proactive. That might mean talking to people ahead of time and letting them know, hey, I'm eating differently. I want you to know ahead of time. I'll bring things. I'll contribute to the meal if you'd like, or if they're willing to do it, but just letting the host and key people know ahead of time your lifestyle choice so that there's a little less of that pressure and why you're doing it. If it's for health, okay, I'm doing it because I have this health condition and this actually helps my health. And then on top of that, I think Dr. Melanie Joy, who wrote the book, Why We Love Dogs, Eat Pigs, and We're Cows, and also she wrote Beyond Beliefs, which is an excellent book about vegan communication. She encourages us to create vegan allies. So if the people in our life are not yet willing to go vegan, we can at least ask them to support our journey and not be a sabotage, for that journey. So, hey, your support means a lot to me. I'm doing this for this and this reason, and I really need your encouragement and support while I'm getting used to this new lifestyle and, going to social events where there isn't the food that I need. I need you to be behind me. And sometimes just by asking for support, people are a little less defensive, because I think our eating vegan puts a mirror in front of people and gets them to question their own eating, even if you're not trying to do that. Or even if you are, sometimes we do want to really try to get people to eat differently, and it might try to push that on people. Either way, we still need to stick to our path. And once it's stronger, we can get into more trying to encourage other people around us if we want to. But the start is just us getting grounded in our own routine till it becomes more natural. So those are some thoughts I have about trying to get centered and be able to handle the social situations, especially early on.
Yeah, those are great. I really like the idea of creating a vegan ally who doesn't necessarily have to be vegan themselves. It could be a family member, it could be a friend, who knows, but they need to be on board with us being vegan, but they don't have to be vegan themselves. And I think that's a barrier for a lot of folks who don't know other vegans. They just assume that no one is going to be supportive, but that's not necessarily the case.
Yeah, it's what you're saying is so true. Certainly, I think I'd add too, is we do need vegan supports, because that really helps us to stay the course and learn how to handle these challenges and feel encouraged. But we're going to have people in our life, if we're outside of just vegan friendships and we're in our everyday life, we're going to have people that are not vegan there. And I personally have found, there's a part of me that wants, of course, everyone to go vegan, because whether for their own health, for the animals, yes, of course. But, we quickly find that trying to pressure people when they're not interested doesn't really work well. But what I found is when I share from the heart why I'm vegan and encourage people to at least understand that, they're for the most part, often very supportive, because it takes down the defensiveness that I'm not saying you have to go vegan, even if I might wish that they would look in that direction. So it takes away some of that conflict, I guess, that can be there around food choices. And you can start to figure out solutions. If you share a household with someone that's not vegan, how are you guys going to handle meals, and how are you going to handle different situations?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think what you're saying about having vegan allies who are vegan themselves, that's important as well. We noticed in our coaching practice, our clients are all vegan. A lot of times people ask, like, so how do you broach veganism with your clients? I'm like, they're coming to us because we're vegan. Yes. So, we have this massive community worldwide of people who are already plant-based, But especially in early 2020, when gyms shut down, we were all isolating. A lot of our clients started saying things like, oh, I don't know any other vegans, or, oh, I can't go to my monthly meetup group or potluck event anymore. And so we started a group team chat, we call it, with our clients, just to connect about training and food. And everyone's on the same page in trying to be consistent with strength training and doing food prep and all this stuff. And it was so great as a community. We just kept it as an official part of our coaching programs. So even now, 5 years later, it's still the team chat. Everyone's chatting about veganism and this kind of stuff that we're talking about, navigating social events. A lot of folks are brand new to veganism and they have their first major holiday that they have to navigate as a vegan. And so all of these things come up, having your why, having vegan allies, being proactive, like you mentioned, having chats with folks beforehand, arming ourselves with delicious vegan desserts we can share, thinking ahead. So I do think it's important. And that's why online communities like the subreddits I've been on, or Facebook groups, or whatever it is for someone, even a podcast, is great for creating that community. And, oh, there are other people who think like I do. And I think that in itself helps a lot of us. But I'm wondering in general more about emotional well-being. I mean, you were a psychotherapist for 25 years. So I assume this is something that you've worked on for a long time with clients. But a lot of people see emotional well-being in general, not necessarily related to veganism, as having to be positive all the time, having to be happy all the time. But that's not the case, is it?
No, you're speaking to something that's actually one of my chapters dives deeply into that.
Okay.
Yeah, that was an interesting topic to cover because I think you're right. A lot of times there's this idea that being emotionally fulfilled or having well-being is about this constant happiness or cheerfulness, and that really doesn't turn out to be true. Just a more general dive into the research. So positive psychology, one of the books that I really enjoyed, he gets into emotional well-being and authentic fulfillment as a better way to look at our well-being instead of happiness per se. This idea that we have to always feel good. And there's a lot of research that shows our well-being is tied in with different things like having good relationships, having meaningful activities that bring a state of flow, and also emotional, they call it emotional diversity, where we have a range of emotions. So that can include sadness and the emotions we think of as more difficult. Those are as important to our emotional well-being as also having times of happiness and joy. They're part of life, but they also serve a purpose. Tough feelings let us know when something matters to us, or something is affecting us, or something needs to change. So having a life where we can navigate all the emotions, including the more difficult ones, that is so helpful for us to learn. And veganism kind of makes us confront that right head on, because we're facing these really tough things through learning what happens in animal agriculture and other industries that obviously is upsetting. So our challenge is, how do we navigate those feelings, and especially carrying it alone sometimes, without a lot of people around us really getting it. So in spite of that, though, in doing my research, a lot of people still described a great deal of fulfillment and peace and other signs of well-being. So it's certainly highly possible for vegans to be very fulfilled. And the majority of my interviewees said they were very fulfilled. One person put it this way: even though sometimes I feel sad or angry or upset about what happens with animal agriculture, I'm still happier and more joyous and free knowing I'm doing something to make a difference.
Oh, wow.
So
yeah, that's powerful.
It's kind of a paradox. Yeah.
But I mean, it works that way in life. It's not white and black. I just had a conversation like 2 days ago with a friend about part of our identities being, a majority, like being white, for example. But part of our identities at the same time could be an oppressed group, like being female, for example. So it's not one or the other. We're not like majority, minority necessarily. We're not happy all the time or depressed. Like there's a lot of gray area. And I think that needs to be acknowledged a little more,
Yes.
perhaps, especially in veganism?
Yes, definitely. And, certainly eating more whole plant foods, if we have that version of veganism, that can help our mental health too, because the very foods that help our physical well being also help the brain and the nervous system and the gut. And the gut is where a lot of our neurotransmitters are actually formed, like serotonin, things that help us feel better. So, choosing to care for us in our vegan lifestyle, we're animals too. So caring for us as sentient beings while we're caring for other sentient beings by at least including a lot of whole plant foods in there, that can really help the mental health piece of it too. And then obviously there's certain skills we can learn to go through some of the tougher feelings that can come up when we're especially first learning what happens to animals and really having to process that.
Yeah, and I think it also relates to being online as a vegan and knowing what our limits are and how that affects our mental health. A lot of folks go down very deep rabbit holes and it really affects their mental health. And they get to a point where they just have to quit social media, which is that's a fair decision to make. But at the same time, I think if you go into interactions with a certain expectation or a certain outlook, like I chat with internet trolls to amuse myself. It's not affecting my mental health. It's like entertainment for me, right? And I can use it for social media content and I think it's hilarious. But if I go too deep or if I spend too much time, if my whole day is on Reddit, then we run into problems. So again, it's not black and white. We can do some of this work. We can entertain ourselves. We can, spread the good word, but we also have to maintain our sanity while we're doing this.
Yeah. And I think what you're saying about knowing our own limits, I think that's really key. Sometimes in the beginning, we want to learn a lot because we're just fascinated to learn about all of this. And that's understandable. And it's even helpful, I think, in the beginning to really help us be deeply committed. I know for when I switched from vegetarian to become fully vegan, there was a period of time I had to really watch some things that I wouldn't want to watch now, just to emotionally connect with what happened to other animals in the whole animal agriculture and other industries, so that I made that same connection that I had with meat and realized, like you said earlier, that they're all really interconnected. They're all one and the same when it comes down to it. Mm-hmm. So there's a period where we might need to take in a lot of new videos and information to really break through that conditioning and that disconnect that we are raised to have. But once we've made the connection, we don't need to constantly be witnessing disturbing stuff, whether it be videos or people's comments or whatever. So I think it's just as you're mentioning, having an awareness of where our own limits are and where we start to get to that point where it's overwhelming us, not helping us. Mm-hmm. And that it's okay. We don't, unless someone is working directly in activism where they have to witness it as part of their work, and even then it's good to have some kind of awareness so that you can take time away from that and still know your limits, because we need time that's fun and uplifting and that keeps us balanced.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah, I think these are all important things to keep in mind. It makes a difference where in the journey we are.
Yes.
And it makes a difference from day to day, how much mental space, how much capacity we have for these things.
Yeah.
I have a lot more capacity for randomly interacting with internet trolls when I'm having a day that doesn't involve anxiety, for example. Yeah. So, it has to be a constant decision that you're making for yourself, I think.
Exactly. And I think to add to what you're saying, our personalities and our gifts play a role in that too. For example, some people really have the knack at being an activist, a direct action kind of person, and maybe can navigate some of that stuff better than some of others of us. I feel as an empath, certain things just probably cross my limit quicker than they would some other people. And I do better focusing on the positives.
Yeah.
Sharing my vegan activism from a point of this is how veganism helps. So we have our different gifts and our different approaches that work for us. And so knowing your own style and where you work best and handle best.
That's a great point. I think mine's similar. It's ridiculously awesome food. It's fitness and crazy feats of strength that happen to be fueled entirely by plants.
Wow.
and maybe a little bit of the kind of educational background of ethics and lots of environmental content, of course. But yeah, I feel like if I go too far down the, hey, watch this footage rabbit hole, I don't need that. I've been vegan 22 years. I know the deal. I don't need to reacquaint myself with that information. I think it's just going to affect my mental health at that point.
Yeah. And that's good awareness to have.
Fair enough. Well, let's pivot a little bit and talk about lifestyle change in general. So a lot of folks who listen to this show are not vegan. They're either veg curious or they're like right on the edge and they're looking for information like, maybe I should join this group of weirdos. So lifestyle changes, whether it's veganism, whether it is a new fitness routine, whatever it is, it's like, I don't even know how to describe what it is. It's not linear. It's a challenge that has ups and downs. And there's a lot of bullshit out there about how it's supposed to look, right? And because the fitness industry and the diet industry are based on billions of dollars of sales, we have books and we have supplements and we have gadgets and we have everything around how to be a better vegan or how to get the nutrition you need, or, oh, you need this supplement. You need this gym piece of equipment for your best workout. It's all based on sales and not necessarily actual progress. So what can you say to our listeners about lifestyle change in general? What if they're having setbacks? What if something happens like, for example, we have a client who's a brand new vegan, like 6 days, forgot to read the package on a protein powder that had whey in it, among other things. And now she feels like she's failed. So what do you do in that scenario?
Yeah, that's great you're bringing that up. This whole idea that we're not supposed to have setbacks or make mistakes, that can be such a deterrent on the change journey, because in general, I find that the stages of change model is sometimes a helpful way for me to think about how change happens. And obviously, it's not that everybody goes through the stages in the same way or in the same pace, but most of us move through this process of going from where we're not even thinking about change to starting to contemplate change to then preparing and then taking action. However, sometimes we think once we've taken action, it should be all easy from there. But the reality is the stages of change model shows there's also maintenance and learning to set up our life to support the change that we're trying to make. And so having supports in place, having systems in place, having structures in place, habits, routines, schedules, all these things, how do we plan our menu? How do we have the food, available at the times we need it? How do we handle these social situations? How do we read labels? And so one thing that's part of the change process, even though it's not necessarily a stage of change, but it's just so common, is relapse or setbacks. They're just part of that whole process. So I think one part is just normalizing that these setbacks, these errors, these missteps are for most of us likely to happen at some point. And I think the key for how we get through those is to reframe them as learning opportunities, normal and learning opportunities. Mm-hmm. That makes all the difference. If we think it's a failure and, I'm supposed to be perfect and I didn't do that, so why bother? I think our culture kind of teaches that mindset of like, why, if you make a mistake, I don't know, almost to give up or something. But from your work as a coach, and I know from my past work as a therapist, that people are going to have these setbacks. But what makes the difference is if they can see where things went wrong. How can they learn from it? What can they do differently if this were to arise again? And maybe even plan and be proactive for future situations that might be similar. And that just strengthens the momentum. It can really make you even more committed if you can navigate setbacks in that way.
That's a great point. Yeah, I feel like when people have setbacks, it's actually a sign that they've been consistent for long enough. Like someone who is starting a strength training routine might be super gung-ho, hasn't missed a single workout for 3 weeks, but shit happens. Life happens. You have to learn what to do when you miss a workout. Not if you miss a workout, when you miss a workout, because it's going to happen. Yes. And it's the same with being vegan. I mean, after 2 decades of being vegan, you kind of know how it works. But if you're only 2 weeks in, there's a lot to learn. It's a huge change. And
Exactly.
yeah, I think you're absolutely right. We actually have to have systems in place, maybe even before we start, potentially. Well, what happens if planning for the inevitable?
Yes, exactly. And I love how you said that it's actually setbacks are a sign the person's actually been consistent enough to even notice that one happened. I had that same thought years ago when working with people who had, for example, chronic pain. They'd be like, oh my gosh, I was doing so well with managing my pain. And then I did this activity and it's just like, wow, you were actually making progress, or you wouldn't have even noticed that this relapse
Right.
happened. It wasn't just a steady or constantly getting worse. You were making progress, and this is just an indicator, actually, that you were making steps forward.
Totally. And even if there were steps forward, it's never going to be linear.
Yes.
I think it's important to acknowledge those steps.
Yes.
In many different ways.
Yeah.
Like in fitness, it's not just about what the scale says or what your measurements are or how much you're lifting in the gym. It's also about mental health and things that we can't measure, like longevity, until the very end.
Yeah.
But it's important to keep in mind these things, energy levels and sleep. And in the case of being vegan, managing social events, gaining skills, or, practicing role-playing scenarios where you're annoying family members going on and on about how you're not getting enough protein. And, I think it's important to acknowledge the small wins. But like you're saying, I think it's also important to acknowledge that, A, losses are going to happen just inevitably. And B, part of the process is figuring out how you're going to manage those.
I mean, we can't predict every obstacle we might face. And so sometimes they'll come up and surprise us, or sometimes we maybe did predict them, but we weren't fully prepared as much as we thought.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's okay. It's part of learning. And it's, just as you're, I think, reflecting, is how we approach it that matters more than anything.
Totally. Yeah. And I think it always goes back to fitness for me because that's what I do. But very often I will do what I call workout tethering with a client who just needs the extra accountability, whether it's a mental health thing. We have a client who's the sole caregiver right now for a spouse who's ill, whatever it is, big stressors. If there's something like that and someone just needs to do the thing, they just need to be consistent with their workouts. They know that they're good for their own mental health. What I do with one person at a time is we figure out when are you going to work out? Monday, Wednesday, Friday, Tuesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, whatever. And then each of those workouts dictates my ability to do my workout the next day. So if the client misses their Tuesday workout, I can't work out on Wednesday.
Oh.
And if they miss their Thursday workout, I can't do my swim on Friday.
Oh my gosh.
So it doesn't teach them anything about long-term self-management. It's not accountability to themselves, but it proves to them, and we do this for a month at a time, it proves to themselves that they can be consistent with something for 4 weeks.
Wow.
Especially when they're in charge of someone else's behavior, right?
Yeah.
But
That's
every
really
time
clever.
we do this, though, to what you're saying about setbacks, we have a discussion around, well, what happens if something goes wrong? Are there any contingencies? Generally, it's pretty strict. Like Tuesday, you work out. Wednesday, I'm allowed to work out, right? But in the case of one of our clients right now, she's got a couple of different things to do on each day. So there's a little mobility session, there's a boxing session. It all adds up to one workout. But we had a discussion around, well, what happens if you miss one of those things and you do the other two? What happens if you miss two of them and you do one of them? So we have a contingency plan where she can catch up, but only one of the activities on the next day. And I feel that's kind of in the same vein here.
Mm-hmm.
Like, what happens if you go to your family dinner and you accidentally eat something that isn't vegan? Or what happens if you forget to read a label as you're learning what to stock your pantry with and it happens to not be vegan? What are you going to do with that food? How are you going to manage your own mental state in that area, right? So I think that's just being proactive, honestly.
Yeah, definitely. And having a plan, as you're saying, for, okay, what do I do next that's the most on track for me?
Right. Yeah. What does vegan transformation mean? The title of your book.
Yeah. So the vegan transformation for me, and what I thought I found from talking to people who are vegan, is this inner change. I mean, obviously there's a lot of transformation can be a lot of things. It's a change that is dramatic and larger than just the average change. And certainly there can be physical transformation. So that is part of it. But the part I was most looking at in my book, The Vegan Transformation, was the mind, body, spirit connection of what can happen to us internally when we align with our ethics and eat foods that are kinder to all sentient beings and the planet. And also, in many cases, often help our own physical health. What happens inside of us as we embark on that journey and become committed enough to navigate some of the challenges that we might face too? What happens inside? And so I found 7 themes that seem to really dominate the responses that I got from the people I surveyed and interviewed, that ranged from things like just feeling more in alignment with my values itself brings an inner peace and freedom that I hadn't expected. Like a weight is lifted that I didn't know was there. And expanding my compassion. That might not sound like that would be exciting, but that actually is very transformative when I start to open my compassion in a way that I hadn't realized was closed even. Mm-hmm. That I was only letting certain beings into my circle of compassion, and now I've expanded it. A lot of them found purpose and meaning, just as you are working in a field where you're helping other vegans, through your fitness background, and I'm bringing my psychology background. Just so many people I interviewed were in some way creating either a business or doing volunteer work or doing online stuff, just all kinds of things that people were doing to bring their gifts to help this message. There was authentic fulfillment that was much like what you and I were talking about earlier, not necessarily that someone would feel happy all the time, but that they felt at peace and fulfilled because their life it fit with what really mattered to them, and learning to navigate the more tough feelings that are part of just facing reality of what's happening in our world and how do I balance that somehow. Mm-hmm. And a few others. Health empowerment was a big one. Not, some people became vegan mainly for the ethical reasons, but there were some also for health. But a lot of people, no matter what their reason for becoming vegan, health did transform. And so because they were no longer consuming the animal products and were eating more plant foods. So there was this empowerment that there's something I can do. I'm not just beholden to medications and doctors, even though might still need them sometimes, but there's something I can do that makes a difference through what I eat. And that gives me power. And then the final one was spiritual. It was about whether someone identified as religious or spiritual or not. I got a lot of responses that indicated people felt more interconnected with nature, with something beyond themselves, that all of us, the beings, nature, we're all connected in a way that maybe I hadn't realized fully before. Because if, again, we're eating animals, there's a little disconnect where we might not feel that connection as strongly. And so even though I hadn't even thought to ask that question, like, do you feel more connected to all beings or nature? That wasn't something I thought to ask, but it came through the open-ended questions that people just said on their own. And so it seemed like an important enough theme that it needed to be mentioned.
Wow. Glad I asked what that meant, because in my world, transformation, like, not that I assumed this about your book, but transformation is kind of a word that has baggage for me. Like in the fitness world, it implies that you weren't enough to begin with, that you need a transformation in order to be worthy,
Yes. I totally can get that, what you're saying, 100%. Yeah.
Yeah. But I think in this case, it's more about a journey. I mean, the word journey is in your subtitle, so it kind of makes sense.
It's totally that. And kind of like the butterfly analogy, that we're evolving into even more of who we already are.
Mm-hmm. That's why I like the term pre-vegan, because it implies that they actually are vegan deep down.
Yes. Yeah. Well, I guess that, when we're born, we're probably all pre-vegans. It's just it's just conditioned out of us.
Right. Yes. Well, congrats on your book, The Vegan Transformation, A Journey to Heal Yourself and the World. As always, we will have links in our show notes. And it was wonderful to speak with you, Angela. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. I really enjoyed this conversation.
Angela, thanks again for joining me on the show. Access our show notes at nobullshitvegan.com/199 to connect with Angela and order her new book. And at the same link, nobullshitvegan.com/199, sign up for my online, free, fun, ridiculous 200th episode party, where you can join me for meal prep, a live workout, and a live recording of this show's 200th episode. So again, that's all at nobullshitvegan.com/199. Thanks for tuning in.
Thanks for listening to the No Bullshit Vegan podcast at nobullshitvegan.com.